Ladies and gentlemen.
Welcome to the Blockcrunch podcast, the go-to podcast for investors and builders in crypto. And before we get started, just a reminder for you guys out there, the Blockcrunch podcast is intended for informational purposes only. Neither the host nor its guests are licensed financial advisors, and nothing discussed should be construed as financial advice. Views held by Blockcrunch's guests are their own, and sponsorship messages do not constitute financial advice or endorsement. With that out of the way, let's jump right in. Today's episode is brought to you by Protocol Labs, the guys behind Filecoin. And with us today is Colin Efren from Filecoin, who can tell us a little bit more about what's one interesting way that people have used Filecoin to build. So Colin, take it away.
Yeah, Filecoin has been used to store hundreds of petabytes of Web2 data, helping Web3 cross the chasm into what I would argue mass adoption. Developers have built onboarding platforms like Singularity, Estuary, and FileDrive, and more to mimic S3 interfaces and onboard data sets like genocide testimonials from the Shoah Foundation, New York government public data sets, and large scientific data sets from universities like UC Berkeley. Within Web3, Filecoin has been able to provide redundancy for our top NFT platforms like Magic Eden, OpenSea, storing a large fraction of Web3's NFTs, and secure gaming assets through Unreal Engine 5.
Hello there. Now, before we move on, I'd love to thank the hundreds of you who have subscribed to Blockcrunch VIP, because with your support, I've been able to share my real thoughts on specific projects that I don't usually share on interviews in a format that I enjoy more, which is bi-weekly written posts. We've also been able to offer exclusive AMAs, sharing my investment frameworks, interactable models, and breaking down important trends before they become big. Now, we even had Elon Musk comment on one of our threads recently. So if you haven't already, head on over to theblockcrunch.com/VIP, and you can access dozens of hours of research for what you'd spend on a coffee a day. And hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Blockcrunch podcast. Now, on this show, I've interviewed probably dozens and dozens of investors over the past 5 years, and I've learned a ton from everyone that I bring on the show. But at the same time, I also noticed that in the past year, I've noticed a lot of investors converging around similar theses in crypto now. So be it DeFi, NFTs, Metaverse, Layer 1, Layer 2, ZK rollups, and so on. So as part of a 2023 effort, we wanted to reach out to investors who have really contrarian views. And one of those episodes was with Seed Club, and this is that other episode, which I'm really, really excited for. And the context for this is when I asked for contrarian investors with controversial theses on Twitter publicly, our next guest reached out and said he's down to give it a shot. And while you may not agree or have heard of everything that he's investing in, I'm quite excited to really chat with investors who are thinking outside of the box. And Anirudh Pai is a partner at Dragonfly Capital and has been involved with some of their investments and research in emerging markets, using blockchains to disrupt existing industries, as well as building a physical utopia that will take 20 years. So that's something that I'm really, really excited to dive into as well. So this is really different from many episodes we've done before, and it's such a delight to have Ani on. So welcome to the show, man.
No, thanks so much, Jason. Really appreciate it. And yeah, big fan of your work so far. So it's great to finally chat.
Definitely. And as a disclaimer, since we're both investors here, everything we say here is not financial advice. It's our own opinions, doesn't reflect our respective firms. So let's kick it off. So when we first chatted, I think you mentioned you had a very interesting career path, working with a lot of interesting folks before. I don't want to give too much away on my side, but can you talk a bit about it and how it led to where you are?
Yeah, happy to. So I think I was lucky in the broad sense of both being able to grow up in Silicon Valley, and then I did my undergrad in the UK. And I think a large part of that move was in part because at the time, at least pre-Brexit, I imagined, you just interact with a lot more people from across the world, and that's kind of what happened. And so while I was there, I helped create 2 companies. The first was an insect farming company, so kind of ushering a lot of the protein revolution stuff that now gets talked about kind of endlessly. And the second was a simulation software company in London, so kind of pioneering a lot of the cheap, fast simulations that crypto and kind of everyone in high tech kind of uses, from space all the way to manufacturing. And then after that was in bioinformatics, so kind of working at the marriage between radiology and AI as an engineer. And then I started writing a bunch, and I'd always been writing, but this time I took it very seriously. And I was lucky to get caught out by one of Peter Thiel's firms, Pronomos. And so Pronomos is kind of the only investment fund in the world that invests in new cities. And it was run by Patrick Friedman, still is run by Patrick Friedman, who's Milton Friedman's grandson at the time. And, we were kind of like scoping the entire world to figure out like, where can we make the kind of the now broadly known network state possible. And back then it was like all called charter cities. And we had thought about, where would the next Silicon Valley be born, and how could we bring like all of these amazing people in the Valley to a separate place where we can really just tinker on laws and stuff. And so that was great. And then from that ended up doing some work with Kanye on his city, and then was at On Deck for a while investing in crypto space, biotech, and then that led to Dragonfly. So
yeah, that is quite the career, and I think it's one of the most interesting career paths I've seen in crypto as well. And then we're definitely going to dive into the concept of investing in cities, because I think this is the first time we've heard about it on the show. But before that, I'd love to just dig into some of the contrarian theses you have. You've been a very prolific writer, so we've went through everything you've written, and I think one of the things that you've either written or talked about in an interview is that all progress happens at the frontier. So obviously in your career so far, you've stuck at the frontier with like insect farming and so on. But at the same time, you also mentioned spaces like outer space, the mind and body, oceans as like frontiers, and that at Dragonfly, you guys are laser beam focused on using crypto to explore these frontiers. Can you explain kind of what you mean by that exactly? Or maybe any examples of theses or maybe investments or types of companies that you personally look out for?
Yeah, I mean, zooming out, it's always tough to give just kind of a verbatim response of how do you analyze something that's unknown and kind of bring it into physical space, right? So how do you take latent space, things that perhaps don't exist yet, and like talk about them in real time? But if you just look at the history of innovation, I mean, whether it's from Bell Labs or even the history of whaling, which is actually where venture capital arises from, the dawn of whaling, like kind of led to the Carey model and so on and so forth. Like we take a lot of these mental models and apply it to the intersection of crypto and something else, because I think that's the reason debt of crypto in this decade of its life cycle, where the first decade was all about like, what is block space, right? How do we quantify block space? What does this even mean? Is it a commodity? Is it a security, right? And you had all those wars going on still going, but I mean, kind of originated over the past 10 years. And now we're looking, we've kind of solidified a lot of those concerns, and we're looking more to scalability, right? Like, we know this thing works. We know that, essentially Ethereum is like the world computer. And it's like, how do we actually get 1 billion people on this thing? And a lot of business models have, of course, without question, been tried for thousands of years, right? And we're lucky to live off the backs of all the innovation that happened in space, in the oceans, in the mind. And I think I personally spend at least a lot of time, and at least with my background, like taking all those lessons that I learned and like applying it into where can we take the best of what other people have learned and like applying it to crypto, essentially.
Yeah, and has there ever been crypto companies looking in those spaces particularly? Or is it a bit too early for that? Because I don't think I've come across like a space focused crypto company, for instance.
Yeah, I would hearken a lot of the innovation in these specific areas, right? So these were just kind of bubbles of various spaces, like space and is a cynic node for kind of unlimited energy, which I know we'll get into. The oceans represents, like, I would say, a lot of potential scientific research, especially as it relates to biochemistry and biomedicine that hasn't just been unleashed yet, right? And you could say a lot of the regulatory and financial concerns of modern day biotech companies kind of prohibit a lot of that, because if they had more money or it was more of a DAO model per se, which is what a lot of the decentralized science folks would tell you, we would have a lot more kind of progress in the ocean area and taking a lot of that knowledge into the scientific realm. Yeah, like when you think about projects that are actually making money in those spaces, I wouldn't go there just yet, I think in part because of how early everything is. But part of a job, part of both of our jobs is like, where are smart people going, right? What do they, like Chris Dixon said, what are people like working on the weekends? And to see just normal people get excited about, oh, wow, I can actually like have real ownership of these side projects, that whether, they were launching rockets or whether they were like, making finessing like scientific experiments, I think is like very important for crypto, because we're moving outside the realm of you have to be a cryptographer, computer scientist, like someone who knows math very well and can program, and that's it, to like, you can do that, but what else, right? And I think that was very important for Web 1, because the original Web 1 companies of, you could say Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft were made by I guess also Facebook, but certainly Microsoft and Apple, like people who really understood computers. And then over time, the level of abstraction got higher and higher, where you didn't need to understand like BASIC and GUIs and all those things. You could just kind of build on top and make great companies like Zuckerberg. And the second generation of Web 2, which you could say DoorDash, Airbnb, the sharing economy, all those people lived off the backs of their forefathers or ancestors essentially in technology. And I think we're now seeing the same with crypto. And I think that kind of inflection point is going to, rip a lot of faces off, I think, because it's a very hard transition to make, right? Like going from this very kind of degenerate cypherpunk culture a la Blade Runner to like making this accessible for, like mom and pop shops, right? Like who is thinking about that, and that's kind of what's necessary to bring crypto to a billion people and actually like bring core value, I think, to the space.
Yeah, and I remember speaking of like frontier, in the intersection of frontier industries and crypto. I remember there was an initiative to do like space mining for Bitcoin a while back, which was quite wild to me. And I want to double click on that one thing you mentioned, which is decentralized science. This is a term that we don't really hear a lot amongst investor friends. So I'm curious, what is decentralized science? Are there like companies that you can provide examples of as well?
Yeah, so decentralized science, I guess, is effectively the notion that modern scientific research is kind of broken by academia in part because of how bureaucratic everything has gone. I think that's like the short summary of it, where it's like the rise of the managerial class. So going to James Burnham's book in the 50s really made an adverse selection or a market of lemons for scientists, not just in biotech, but you could say like writ large, right? Like you could talk about the stagnation of progress in physics and all those different areas. And in large part, it's like just highly capable people don't want to enter those fields anymore, right? And if that's true of STEM, then it's doubly true of the humanities. And you could say like both of those are more needed now than ever. Yeah, the first wave of decentralized science, so kind of breaking that up with a DAO model. So you could say BioDAO, SciDAO, which is kind of on the psychedelic research side, LabDAO, a bunch of others, kind of took various chunks of the biotech model and kind of broke it apart and sought like had the putative idea of maybe, we could try to do something with crypto and tokenomics to like break up the various parts of scientific research and reward people who come up with amazing discoveries. But like, there's the famous law where it's like, if you discover an idea, very often it's not named after you. It's like disseminated across time. And it's like often named after the person who does something with it. Right. And we care less about that. I think most scientists just care less about necessarily their name being after the invention, but they should get rewarded for it in some sense. And I think that's kind of how a lot of the people of the community are viewing things. If you take the Eric Weinstein hypothesis, so Eric, who used to be managing director at Teal Capital, he would often say that scientific research was commodified in the 80s because a lot of the Western governments kind of lied about how you could say academically poor their own domestic populations were in order to bring on a surplus of immigrants. Whether or not that's true, I think that still like merits a lot of questions, right? Like, why is it that we have so much money going into cancer research? The war on cancer in America was declared in 1970. I wouldn't say we're like 50 years closer to solving cancer, right? I think all these questions are like highly important, and it like just boggles the mind why they go just unasked.
That's interesting because we recently did an episode with a project called Love DAO as well. I think that the founder, Ryan Breslow, mentioned that they're basically doing a DAO to fund medical research that typically isn't funded by conventional means. So these are things like unpatentable things like meditation, breath work and things like that, which I thought was really, really interesting. But it sounds like from what you're saying, there's already DAOs like SciDAO and BioDAO that are doing much more than kind of much more than just medical, but they're doing like actual science, like other fields of scientific research as well, right?
Yep. Yeah, and I think there's a bifurcation in crypto. So going off of that point, there are a lot of things in crypto that I think are very intellectually curious, right? But I think as investors, we're kind of trusted to make accurate decisions and be stewards of capital and like a fiduciary way, right? So I think as investors, it's always important to like walk the fine line between very, you could say, immoderate ideas. So ideas that maybe will happen in like 15 years, and ideas that like are actually happening right now and it makes sense to deploy, right? And I think timing in crypto is always something that people get off. Like, we can love these ideas, but it's like a mistake of the first order, I say, to be like too obsessed. And then you start thinking like, oh, I'll give the money, and then they have to just make money, right? But it like often doesn't work like that in business. It's like you have to like hit the pieces one by one and like sequentially dole out the right steps. Otherwise, you're kind of out of luck, I think. And so that's like a fine line we have to walk, where you need to be kind of obsessed with the frontier of like knowledge that's not yet known, but at the same time, like figure out like what's actually true, right? In crypto, I think if the last year has shown us anything, it's that frauds happen where you just least expect it, and you just always have to be vigilant. So
Yeah, and before I move on from this decentralized scientific piece, how far away is this thesis? Like, obviously, with things like DeFi, NFTs, there's clear product market fit. There's millions of people who may use these things. But then for decentralized science, it still seems like a very niche subvertical. Do you think this is something that is on the verge of breaking out? What's going to take for this to become like a mainstream category?
I think decentralized science has become kind of a catch-all word for any modality of DAOs plus research. But I think when we talk about other areas as well, even if it's like space and energy and transportation, like the whole DePIN or decentralized physical network space, including decentralized wireless, I think all of those kind of belong in the same category. I think less with decentralized wireless because there's, I think, much more of a business model there than with all a lot of these other categories. I think, for example, decentralized wireless, like I just mentioned, which is kind of breaking up the telecom incumbency across the West, and I know we'll talk more about that in a bit. But actual business model. Whereas a lot of these DAO models, you struggle to figure out like where are the monetizable pieces kind of coming in, and I think that's a big question that a lot of DAOs failed to answer last year after the bubble of 2021 and the essential catastrophe. Which is like, it's great to have people figure out this new political philosophy, and I think that's deeply needed in crypto. But have we made an optimal improvement in like governance? And I think that still remains to be answered. And I think making money is downstream of that, actually. Like, if the organizational model is so much more efficient and makes people so much more productive, like that should show up somewhere, I think. And I think all investors are still just waiting to see like, where is that showing up, right? Where are the productivity stats of like, which DAO cracked it? And if they did crack it, like where, how are we seeing it kind of implemented? And I think until then, a lot of these, whether it's decentralized science itself in the biotech sense or all these other areas, I think they all kind of fall downstream of that. So probably in a few years, I mean, I don't know, probably not next cycle, maybe the cycle after that, but again, tough to say, right? Like, I think there's just so many miracles that need to happen. And they say for every great business, right, there's at least one miracle you need to solve. And I think for a lot of these companies, it's like they have to solve 3 or 5 miracles like in a row. And I think that's where it gets like very tough.
What's your personal kind of intuition? Like, is there a specific vertical within decentralized science that you think, hey, this is probably going to be the first thing that takes off?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my bias goes to where, and I think when we're investing, we should always answer the question, like, where do people need this the most? And I think even though a lot of crypto activity is centered around New York, a lot of people in America, just for the most part, don't need crypto. And you could say like the only product right now in crypto that has amazing product market fit where people like sorely need crypto is with stablecoins, right? And like that's kind of the classic answer that people give where it's like, oh, where is crypto being used? In the decentralized science case, I think the next step of this is going to be, as dollarization and the preeminence of the dollar continues to skyrocket and destroy a lot of emerging market economies, I actually think, and I know a lot of people have started talking about this, that like getting access to domestic energy becomes like fundamental. And I think maybe that'll be first before like we completely revolutionize biotech investing and biotech research, because that's great. But biotech generally in the West kind of works as a sector, right? Like it's not as if there's tons of market inefficiencies. And yes, there should be a lot more drugs brought to light. No one is like saying the opposite. But many parts of the world just don't get access to electricity. And you can even take the example of like Nigeria, which is kind of being brought up as a country that is at the forefront of a lot of African technological progress. And I think it is. But at the same time, how does entrepreneurship work when your electrical generator goes off like 3 times a day in your city, right? It's like just very tough to make that happen in a world where like bits dominate over atoms. And so I would say stuff like that, right? Like how do we fix market dislocations for deeply necessary problems like energy first before like we're thinking way ahead in the future of like all these kind of Panglossian biotech ideas.
Yeah, and I think this is actually an interesting segue to my next question, which is this view that you have about metaverses. So obviously, I think in 2021 onwards, there's been a lot of hype over this idea of metaverses, in the virtual worlds. And I think the piece that you wrote is that metaverse is actually bad for humanity. And I think you had an almost anti-game thesis. At least that's how I interpreted it. Games like Roblox, calling them distractions. So this is in contrast, obviously, to many investors that we've brought on the show who only invest in games in the metaverse. So I guess first, can you explain where that view stems from, and then maybe later on we can, segue to talk about Praxis and City investing as well.
Exactly. Yeah, I think I would like to just add, clarify. So the metaverse I was talking about, I think, is very much kind of like the sort of doomer aesthetic of Ready Player One or all the kind of movies of 20th century Hollywood, which is like if we have runaway technological growth, it's going to be the end of like the world essentially, right? And so the metaverse in my piece, I think, was much more of a attack on that, of like how kind of mainstream filmmakers and all those people, even people in the media, kind of think about it. But I believe, and I think I think we all do, because we're investing in crypto, that crypto is a frontier that has the possibility of like changing the physical world. And I think that's kind of the logical conclusion of my piece, which is we need to take the gains of gaming and like everything that we do virtually and use it to like rebuild the physical world. So if the 20th century was a story about like how we extract resources from the earth, and so the biggest fortunes in the 20th century were mining companies and oil companies and like essentially people that like relied on fossil fuels. I think this century is all about how do we modernize and electrify the world, so kind of moving away from the petrodollar all the way to the electrodollar, right? And I think that shift's going to be just a massive inflection point in general, and it has to be, because like we're moving from a completely unsustainable process. And yes, there's tons of hydrocarbons underneath the earth, no one's disputing that, but at the same time, it's not going to get humanity to the next level, right? And if you just look at America is about what, 4% of the population. Like just because we produce the most oil or whatever does not mean that like translates to a more even future everywhere else, right? So given that we have access to this abundance, to this cornucopia of riches, and the metaverse and investors are like piling into these things, I think it's kind of our duty to like take that money and then use it to like rebuild everything around us, right? Because if research in on computer stops, and all those things, and making computers is a deeply physical process, as we're now seeing with TSMC and all the kind of the dialectic kind of arising in Taiwan and China and the US, like that affects crypto, right? And I don't see too many people like really hitting the bellwether on that.
I guess just to kind of double click on that, I'm curious what you think about the stance taken by companies like Meta, right, where they pivoted the entire company to focus on building virtual worlds under the guise of maintaining better connections between people in the world, because you can facilitate better connections in a, I guess, fully immersive setting versus just like messaging or like WhatsApp or whatever. Like to me, there's always something a little bit dystopian about that, but at the same time, I also understand where they're coming from in terms of creating a more connective world. I'm curious, like, what you think about that. Is that something that fundamentally we should not be pursuing?
Well, we don't have a choice but to go into that connected future, I think. I mean, if you define globalism as kind of the free movement of ideas, capital, and people, we kind of hit that peak, you could say, in the last decade, right? And so the next iteration of globalism is literally just what Meta is working on, of, you think about something and then with Neuralink, that thought is instantly transferred without you even having to type to your best friend like a mile away or 500 miles away, right? So completely bypassing the need for planes, travel, all those things. So I think it's almost like the final state of globalism, which is kind of, it makes perfect sense why a lot of companies are going that way, because like technology is a unit of globalization, right? And same with crypto. I mean, those are all like part and parcel of this huge globalizing thesis that happened in my mind like hundreds of years ago, and that's now finally come to fruition. And if you look at the effect that globalism has had in a lot of places, I mean, it still remains to be seen in the second and third order consequences. But in the first approximation, it's caused like a lot of like equal amounts of disruption as like the first industrial revolution, right? So it took about 100 years, you could say, in the 19th century, from like 1820, which is when people typically think the industrial revolution started, all the way to further times, like the second industrial revolution, I guess. It took a long time for it to play out. And I think the same thing is happening here, where like we unleashed the plague, so to speak, and now we're like just coming to terms with like how much this has helped or hurt people. Before doing anything like that, I would always like demonstrate some caution, right? Like, who knows where we're going? Like, how does this impact everything else? are we still making sure like things actually work, like there's state capacity in a lot of cases? And I think if that's not sure, then we should just be, cautious of like where we're going.
Yeah, and I've always been a little bit resentful of the fact that when we first came into crypto, I think a lot of the dream and mission was to bank the unbanked, right? Create DeFi, and try to bring financial services to the developing world. And then for some, I guess for some very understandable reasons, over the past few years, a lot of the capital started flowing into VR, virtual worlds, or games, which I think is important, but at the same time it doesn't strike me as urgent as like some of the problems that DeFi was solving. So I don't think I'm as extreme as your view when it comes to metaverses, but I definitely understand kind of where it's coming from. But I'd love to kind of use that as an opportunity to talk about Praxis, which is one of the weirdest things that I've come across in crypto. I think I spoke to the team about a year ago, and they mentioned that it's going to take them like 20 years to build a new city. So can you give us the download on, first of all, how you got involved, like what is Praxis, and, how did you decide to kind of, do this?
Yeah. So, really quick, just double clicking on the metaverse point again. My overall stance is like, we were very early investors, like Dragonfly, me, myself, in a lot of these companies. I just think it's also our job to like figure out like how we take a lot of the iteration and wealth that we make in those places and kind of apply it broadly. So Praxis is a direct result of that, actually. So I think a lot of people read that piece and they thought that I hate crypto or like, I'm just a massive bear. But I think the people, there's some element of this like Straussian reading to the piece, which is like, if you read closely, it's like, oh, we're lucky to live in a time where we can iterate so quickly, because if we had lived like 500 years ago, right, like, the pace of knowledge transmission would have been just so low that we never would have been able to learn all this stuff to like just iterate and fix problems quickly. So Praxis, I think, exists like analogously to a lot of that, which is, cities are why we've had this like amazing kind of Faustian growth in the West. And it's the knowledge economy that a lot of cities offer. And because of that, which they prosper, right? So now technology makes up 20% of the US economy. And the top 5 companies in technology, all of the FANG names or whatever, they were all kind of made in the same area, right? And many people have tried to recreate that, but you can't recreate something that happens once, right? You have to figure out like what's next and kind of converge on, or kind of really just improve, and you can't really leapfrog. So the Praxis idea kind of started off with the notion that cities are labor markets. People move to cities for a job, they make a ton of money, and then they cash out in the social market. So they get married and then they move to the suburbs. But the dawn of COVID made it so that you could actually live with people that now shared your values instead of people who also worked at Goldman Sachs, right? And that like unlocks just tons of new behavior, I think, and new experimentation that we haven't seen before. So essentially the goal now is to kind of build a world's first crypto city in Western Europe, and that process is in motion. It's been amazing to just see the response that Praxis has gotten, because as an early investor myself, and someone that kind of helped with this at Pronomos, I think the big change that I saw was back then it was like 100 of us kind of thinking about cities need to be rebuilt, like who's doing this. There wasn't a lot of kind of interest in the space at all, and I think now we're lucky to build off the backs of like the network state egregore and like all these ideas that people talk about. And when you even talk about the network state thesis, right, like people love this idea, but they don't actually figure out like which companies work in the space. And obviously I'm biased, but I haven't seen kind of anyone else outside of Praxis really do this properly or even have demand, because what separates Praxis from everyone else is the demand first thesis. So kind of getting people who really want to exit and be around people who share these same values versus people who are just like, oh, I might, maybe I'll go, maybe I won't. You can't really do that, right? So it's like the people who left to America in the early days, the original immigrants, they knew without a shred of doubt that they were never coming back to Europe. And I think, exit's not meant to be an easy choice, but sometimes that's what it takes for progress, right? You have to just go to the frontier and like make it work. And that's true of like all the most innovative companies, I think, of all time.
So just to clarify, so Praxis is trying to build a physical city as a technical utopia. Is that the kind of mission?
Well, I would hesitate to call it a utopia per se. A lot of people have also referred it to likened it to Galt's Gulch from Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged novel. I wouldn't say that per se, but at a vanilla level, in part because so much is still left to be done, I would say that crypto itself is such a unique oddity in the world. And I think that's why we have so many of these conferences like all across the globe, right? It's like many people cannot stand being in the city that they're in where they have no crypto people and they want to just be around them constantly, right? In a pervasive, seamless way. And they imagine a world in which, like it would just be nice to have like the crypto, like Silicon Valley, right? And I think the closest we've gone is New York, but even then it's like still not ideal, right? Because you kind of want to be around the people who share your same values all the time in an optimal world. You don't want it to kind of just be opting into that sometimes, then you have to deal with everything else that comes with being in a big city that doesn't necessarily care about what you're working on. So yeah, it'll be a physical city, and I think the company's already assembled like a great list of people who are ready to move. But those are the things that I think will really push crypto forward, right? So that's like the merge of bits and atoms, and I think it's regardless of what happens, I think just pushing the Overton window in crypto is something that's deeply necessary, because in past writings I made reference to kind of like the L1 trade, right? And that's something that we all have to do, because like L1s are still very highly profitable opportunities. We've at Dragonfly, we've been kind of coined them as very close to cities itself, because in a sense they are like virtual cities, the EVM versus non-EVM and stuff like that. But still, right, it's like now that we have abundant block space, how do we use that to attach ourselves to real estate, telecoms, science, like all those things? And I think like that's what's going to define amazing returns over this decade, like if you could do that switch or not.
So I'm curious logistically how this is done, because I remember when we were researching this episode, we were looking at the cost of building a city, and we realized there's a reason why it's all driven by large governments, driven by tax revenue. Because I think the pre-inflation cost of the estimated cost of building up like New York City was something like 2.5 trillion. So how is it possible we can do this in a private sector, or yes, in a DAO setting?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we look at like what made a better analogy might be when we look at like what made tech startups so different to the companies that the big incumbents that existed before them. It was just largely very small teams, ownership, and like sprints, right, which have now become kind of commonplace in the industry. Obviously, you didn't have like sprints per se when they were building semiconductors, but as software continued to eat the world, it was like, we can do a lot more with less. Therefore, we should check in like more frequently, and you guys have more free time because we trust that you're more productive. In the city sense, how this looks like is we can, bring in like a few thousand people, so anywhere from a few thousand to 10,000 people, test out the model, see what needs to be changed with governance and all of that. And we have a lot of ideas for, there are a lot of ideas here for governance, but you never know until it's like actually tested, right? And people always talk about like SpaceX going to Mars. My first question about that was like, what governance model are they using on Mars, right? I doubt it can just be direct democracy. And the scariest part is that we just don't know. And before we undergo, as someone who's a massive fan of space and like would love to go, I think it's still important to figure out like all the iterations of governance before we get there. And I think that's like all the stuff that Praxis has to test out first when people first move. Like, how do we make sure that many of these highly ambitious, like just iconoclastic people exist in one place in a model where they feel like they're heard, but it's not like completely dominated by like an oligarchy, right? And there are a lot of ideas of how to tackle that, but the fundamental question still stands, which is that I don't take the Fukuyama view, which is that liberal democracy is kind of just the end of it, right? I think technology will give us a lot more ways of governance, and I think you're seeing that already kind of play out online, right? Like how different and varied the kind of discussion forums around governance kind of end up being, and like all these DAOs taking weird models. I think that's actually very good for the space. And it reminds me of, when the great divergence of Europe that I brought up, so around 1820, when Europe really started, Western Europe and the UK really started to diverge away from the rest of the world. A lot of that was driven in part just by like weird cults that they had at the time, and like all these just niche communities of, you could say like the Hobbit Shire and like all those things, right? Just like people tinkering and like small groups and coming up with just ideas that would like manifold and just change the world, right? And I think in the sense of a physical city, we're testing it digitally and then taking the best of what we figure out digitally via the online community and then applying that transmission mechanism physically. And I see a lot of people who have digital communities, but they don't have physical communities. So it'll be interesting to see how these two get married.
Yeah, and I'm curious, how do you prevent something like Praxis from being, a tech bro suburb? Like you built basically a neighborhood of just like crypto bros in like San Francisco. So like, how do you make sure that this is actually a distinct, like sovereign city, with its own rules and laws maybe, and then with its own property and so on, instead of just being, what's the difference between that and like a community of crypto people or crypto enthusiasts in an existing city?
Well, even though I'm not part of the team, I guess as somebody who spent a lot of time in the space, what I would say is that crypto here is just the wedge. So these are the people that are most likely to break their lease, if they even have lease, right? As you and I know, a lot of the people we interact with don't live anywhere. They're just perpetual nomads.
On a plane, yeah.
And do they ever want to live anywhere? I doubt it, right? Do they ever want to settle down? I don't think so. So you have those people who kind of really want to make it work, and they finally found a place where they can kind of be themselves. So crypto acts as the real wedge here that will bring a ton of industry in my mind. And once you have industry and you have a sustainable populace of like things that actually work, you find like that's more than enough, because many of these other city projects, you can even talk about Neom or all those, charter city projects are doing in Africa and all these places, they struggle to get demand. Like supply is actually infinite. Like you could fit all of Earth's population side by side, essentially on like the land surface of New York and the islands. So it's like there's not that many people, and I think maybe I'm wrong here, but you could also fit them side by side in Texas, like just straight, so in a horizontal line. Like there's not that many people on Earth. Most of Earth is completely empty, and there are a lot of tailwinds that exist here as well, right? So you have to look at like probably the most momentous technological decision since the iPhone in some ways is the T-Mobile partnership with Starlink. And now Starlink has effectively repriced all real estate across the world, because you can use your mobile phone and escape the autocrat who's banning your internet access with a satellite. And I just find that completely fascinating, right? So we're taking what is dirt cheap land, bringing in amazing people, and building industry. And I think that vision of the future is like certainly the one I want to live in, right? Where we're like modernizing the world. You're not trapped by the zip code or latitude of the area that you were born in instead, or even you could travel to, but it's like, oh wow, we can actually like change the physical world. And I think we've seen so much change, yes and no, in the virtual world. Like websites change, whatever, but I think we need both simultaneously to see the real innovation that we all have come to expect.
Yeah, and I think I can spend a lot more time in Praxis, but for the purpose of, in the interest of time, I do think we have to move on. But one last question. I'm just curious, like, where is Praxis today?
So I think there's been a lot of work around figuring out where the land should be and what the right partners are. I don't think I can say any more beyond that, but the growth in the community, and there's going to be a lot of fun stuff, I think, coming out in the next few months that will shock a lot of people. But the feedback we've gotten, or like the team has gotten, I'd say, from all these partners across the world has been extraordinary. Like they all kind of just see the talent in one place. And as investors, you always want to be around scenes, right? Like even if you disagree with what people are saying, the most important thing is to just have the mental model in your mind. And obviously something like Praxis like pisses a lot of people off, right? Maybe they don't understand the concept. Maybe they do, and they just, don't like vibe with it. But at the same time, you find as an investor, like, a lot of people disagree with the EV thesis. Still, Elon came around, right? Even when they met Elon, they thought he couldn't do it. And I think it's always good to just keep in your mind, like, if this works, like how much could this change things, right? And sure, you might be wrong once, but you should just never fade scenes. And people made the mistake with Aptos in a different scene, right? Like, there's so many things that, knock on wood, right, for now, but for the most part, if you find amazing people doing something that you just don't expect, I found that my best returns have always been in those places where it's like, oh, I don't, whether it was gaming in Southeast Asia, right, pre 2020, and the start of a lot of, not necessarily Axie, but like, just play to earn becoming the thing. I don't think anyone would have thought that the Philippines would have just centered around an idea so strongly as that. And I think Praxis has a lot of similarities to the like small roots kind of growing globally, and like that notion of the network state really picking off and like just skyrocketing and surprising to the upside in a way that no one expected. So yeah, I think the next few months and the years to come, we'll just see the land get chosen, the solidification in a lot of the early community. But yeah, a lot more I can't say, but I'd say
Yeah.
like that
No,
for
and
now.
I always appreciate when investors kind of have these very grand theses as well, because that in the end of at the end of the day is what kind of drives returns for venture. And I think a lot of the kind of shorter term or like trader types that we've talked to on the show, they tend to be a bit more cynical or maybe more realistic about what's happening in the market, but at the same time, their pitfall is often that they miss out on the next big things. Whereas I think a lot of the venture investors we talked to on the show tend to be overly exuberant in the long term, but they are the ones that actually catch the breakthrough. So it's always interesting to me to find that balance in the middle as someone who tries to navigate both the liquid and the primary markets. And speaking of markets, I'd love to tie this into investments as well. I know investors have a different answer to this every month, and that's the excitement of the VC job. But at the moment, what would you say is your favorite or maybe most interesting or maybe company that dominates your mind share the most now?
Ooh, that's tough. But before we get into that, it's just something you reminded me of is this line by Yeats, the poet, which is like the best lack conviction and the worst are full of passion and intensity. And I think that like best encapsulates crypto, where it's like, sometimes people just know they're right, but they're scared to just go big, right? And I think our job is to like, if you've done the work and you size it properly, whatever, you just have to go big, right? It's like those things that end up like really changing things versus the minuscule kind of menu of improvements we've come to expect. But yeah, there is a company that we've invested in recently. It hasn't announced yet, so it's tough to talk about it. But I guess I could talk about the space that it's in. I think both of those kind of would be the same. But the smartest group of investors I've seen recently aggregate in one place has been around like decentralized wireless. So kind of what I said before, the notion of like rebuilding a lot of the telecom stack as it relates to even the innovations of Starlink and Starlink V2 to give people around the world cheap internet access. When we look at what crypto has to do in the next cycle, you have to find ways of like making money. And I think the growth streams that we've had over, you could say, the past three big cycles. So whether it was 2013, 2015, 2017, so before this recent one, right? So like in that last decade, they were all just kind of written up by like money printing, right? We've been printing money at constant rates, basically since the 70s. And a lot of that money has gone into crypto, whether abroad or otherwise, domestically in the US. I think going forward, we have to find ways to tie crypto to actual revenue. And I think that's been on the minds of everyone, right? Like, oh my God, how does this make money? And, that doesn't mean big dreams don't get funded. In fact, it's just like the plan of getting there has to be concrete, and you can't just push it away like much of the sharing economy stocks of the last decade. So wireless is interesting because the business model is already there. It's highly inflationary resistant. Like, for example, telecoms just raise prices. And what are you going to do? Not pay for internet, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. But I'd say, as people come to see, the company we've backed is really rebuilding that process. And I think the future of a lot of this stuff exists in commodity markets. And so people forget that like the first oil futures contract, which now has like dominated the world, right? Like everyone, maybe like they've all heard of oil futures, of like they traded them. That arose in the late 70s or 80s. So it's actually a brand new invention in the sense of like financial engineering. The same is going to be true of, I think, a lot of compute and bandwidth. And we've seen it a bit with compute, like block space to a degree is kind of a derivative of compute in some sense. But we haven't really seen it with bandwidth, which is pretty bizarre considering how important that is going to be going forward. One reason for that is because of how much capex it takes to actually get these things off the ground. And in a world with fractured capital markets, like we're probably going to see over this decade, we had the greatest amount of boomers retire in 2020. So that's like the biggest chunk of the population kind of retiring at the same time, taking that money out of the capital system. So this capital flight, coupled with like the capital intensity needed to build these networks for more and more people who need the internet, it's like a perfect space of disruption for decentralized kind of wireless markets and bandwidth. So that's one area that I'm super excited by. I think the second would also be a lot of the innovations on like the L2 stack. So not necessarily like optimism and stuff, but this will be coming out very shortly. But kind of like how do we solidify the EVM's dominance, or like make the EVM a lot better, as Vitalik said, with rollups and app chains, because I think that's going to be vital as like games and anything that's consumer, which you could say is all of crypto right now as it scales. And there just has to be better and more seamless ways of making that happen for developers. And the DYDX move to Cosmos might be, one of the most pivotal things of like crypto, maybe in the future, right? It's like, oh, wow, we should have actually just done this on app chains and rollups going forward.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I know exactly what company you're talking about for the second one, but I'll leave that to you guys to announce it. So we'd love to end this episode usually with something to take away for founders, operators. And one thing that really struck with me that you wrote is that, founders in crypto now can't just be cryptographers. They got to be, polymaths. I'm curious, for aspiring founders out there who might not be, genius polymaths, what are some of the ways that they can be effective founders in this space?
Yeah, because crypto moves so rapidly and in a direction that you kind of just get pulled from all sides, right? Every day there's a new hype. Like there's, a new word kind of being made, a la Shakespeare, that people have no idea and it just gets hyped. I think the best thing to do would be to look out and just figure out where you think people really need your crypto product and where you see that going. And so I made that point earlier about, decentralized energy existing in places where, the energy market just doesn't exist, right? Fundamentally, crypto is a market because we're all paying a certain amount for block space. And like when you put something on block space, you have to make sure that, if you want people like to charge a premium, which effectively you're kind of doing, right, as a crypto company, like that there's actual demand for what you're doing. It can't just be, I have an idea and I put it on chain and I get paid for it. Like that kind of stream of events just won't work in the future. So for resident founders who are just kind of starting off, like pick an idea in a market of crypto that you really think is going to be used. And it doesn't matter if it's sexy, like who cares if the market like prices a sexy idea very highly right now? Because as we've seen, the sexiest companies in crypto, even if they're not frauds, like we saw last year, like end up just getting priced where they should be, right? So like close to zero if they're not doing anything. That's kind of what I would say. Like, think for yourself, like be widely read, exist in various scenes, and try to take all the learnings, not even in crypto, and just apply it to the space. I would also add, I think as an optimistic note, that about 20% of the US economy is also financial services. And this the same is true for like many kind of big countries and stuff. That just means that people are paid 20 cents on the dollar to store bits, move bits, and then store bits somewhere else. The bullish case for crypto is that it completely eradicates that entire need. And so for people that think they're super late, the fact that there's such a massive financial services industry in the world just disproves that point, right? And I think about that a lot. Like, why are people paid so much money to just move ones and zeros somewhere else and store them, right? That should not exist. And I think that's kind of the future we're building towards of, the sovereign individual. So.
Yeah, and I think that's an amazing note to end this on. So thank you so much for coming on, Ani. And what's the best way for people to maybe reach out to you or follow your thoughts and your writing?
Yeah, I'd say the best way to reach me if you want to DM or just follow my thoughts is Twitter. So Ani, ANI_PAI. I also have my newsletter, Dreams of Electric Sheep, so electricsheep.substack.com. But no, thanks so much, Jason. Had a great time.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. All right, that's it for this week's episode of the Blockcrunch podcast. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe on your favorite apps. And in case you didn't know, this interview is also available as a video on YouTube. And if you tag the Blockcrunch on Twitter this week and tell us what you liked about this episode, I'll be sure to respond to you as well. Now, if you'd like to go even deeper, we have a VIP tier where every week or so, we write an in-depth research brief or investment memo on a project. And we'll have exclusive AMAs with myself where I answer all your questions as well. Now, we already have analysts from some of the top funds and companies in crypto as subscribers. So if you're serious about getting an edge in crypto, head on over to theblockcrunch.com/VIP to learn more. And once again, thanks for supporting the show, and I'll see you next week.